Imagine a world teetering on the brink of total war, where two colossal powers, driven by conflicting ideologies, are about to collide in a confrontation that will reshape history forever. In June 1941, Germany, under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, launched an ambitious and ideologically fueled invasion of the Soviet Union, an operation that would later be known as Barbarossa. Unlike meticulously planned campaigns, this invasion was hastily conceived, driven more by political and racial ideology than by practical military strategy. The goal was audacious: to achieve a swift and decisive victory that would crush the Soviet Union before winter set in. But reality proved far harsher than anyone anticipated. From the very beginning, the stakes were unimaginably high. Germany sought not only territorial expansion but also the eradication of what it considered the ideological enemy: communism. Hitler's vision of conquest was intertwined with a distorted racial worldview, which meant that civilians were often treated as expendable obstacles rather than human beings. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, a vast country spanning millions of square kilometers, was caught off guard. Despite intelligence warnings, Stalin and his leadership struggled to grasp the scale and speed of the German advance. As the first troops crossed the border, the world watched in a mix of shock and disbelief. For millions of ordinary people, life was about to change forever. Cities that had once been hubs of culture, trade, and daily life were suddenly thrust into chaos. Soldiers and civilians alike were forced to confront the unimaginable horrors of war. Battles that erupted in towns and villages reduced to rubble, and families torn apart by the sudden onslaught. Yet, even in the face of overwhelming odds, the Soviet people demonstrated resilience that would astonish the invaders. Communities organized defenses, improvised with limited resources, and fought not just for survival but for the preservation of their homeland. The early days of Operation Barbarossa reveal a critical lesson about war and human determination. A plan, no matter how ambitious, can falter if it underestimates the spirit, ingenuity, and endurance of those it seeks to conquer. As we journey through the harrowing events of this campaign, from the rapid German advances to the desperate Soviet resistance, you will witness moments of both tragedy and extraordinary courage. If you are fascinated by history, strategy, and the untold stories of human endurance, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss any part of this gripping series. Every like and subscription helps us bring these incredible stories to life, shedding light on events that shape the world we live in today. Stay with us as we explore the horrors of Leningrad, the battles that defined the early years of Operation Barbarossa, and the remarkable resilience of those who faced impossible odds. As the German war machine rolled across the vast expanses of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, it became increasingly clear that this was not merely a conventional conflict over territory or resources, but a monumental clash of ideologies that would leave an indelible mark on the world. On one side stood fascism, a rigid and uncompromising political system obsessed with conquest, racial hierarchy, and the assertion of dominance over what it deemed inferior populations. On the other side stood communism, a worldview rooted in collective ownership, class struggle, and the defense of a sprawling, resource-rich nation determined to survive against a seemingly unstoppable foe. From the very first moments of the invasion, the contours of this ideological battle shaped not only military strategy, but also the treatment of civilians, the behavior of soldiers, and the brutal reality of life on the front lines. The German army, highly disciplined and technologically advanced, moved with astonishing speed across the Soviet borders, often leaving behind a trail of devastation. Yet, what distinguished this campaign from earlier wars was the extent to which Nazi ideology dictated every decision, transforming military operations into a theater of systematic dehumanization. German commanders were not simply pursuing objectives on a map. They were carrying out a vision that viewed the people of the Soviet Union as obstacles to be removed. A worldview in which the boundaries between combatants and civilians blurred into irrelevance. This ideological lens intensified the violence, making every town, village, and city a potential target, not only for strategic conquest but also as a demonstration of power and supremacy. The destruction of Leningrad, the sieges of key cities, and the deliberate targeting of food supplies were all driven as much by an intent to break the spirit of a people as by conventional military reasoning, revealing the grim interplay between ideology and warfare. Yet, the Soviet Union, immense in both size and population, was far from passive. Despite the shock of the initial invasion and the devastating losses suffered by the Red Army due to prior purges and miscalculations, the resolve of ordinary soldiers and civilians began to manifest in ways that confounded the German planners. The people of Leningrad, Moscow, and other major cities understood that this struggle was existential. They were defending not just land or property, but their very way of life. Factories were repurposed overnight, communities organized local militias, and a vast logistical effort was undertaken to maintain supply lines under conditions of extreme duress. The ideological framing of the war, rather than intimidating the Soviet population into submission, often galvanized them, transforming abstract political principles into deeply personal motivations for survival and resistance. The clash of fascism and communism also played out in the starkly different approaches to leadership and obedience on the battlefield. German officers, confident in their training and technology, often underestimated the adaptability and resilience of Soviet commanders and soldiers, assuming that ideological rigidity among their opponents would lead to predictable responses. Yet, as battles raged and encirclements were challenged, improvisation became essential for survival. Soviet units learned to exploit the weaknesses of their adversaries, using knowledge of local terrain, makeshift defenses, and sheer tenacity to counteract the rapid mechanized advances of the Wehrmacht. In this sense, the ideological struggle was mirrored in tactical innovation. The Soviets' commitment to defending the motherland at all costs allowed them to convert despair into determination, turning the invaders' assumptions against them in critical engagements. Beyond the battlefield, the ideological dimensions of the conflict shaped the human experience in ways that were both horrifying and remarkable. Civilians found themselves caught between the uncompromising ideologies of two totalitarian systems, forced to navigate starvation, displacement, and constant threat of violence. Yet, even in the darkest moments, examples of courage, resourcefulness, and solidarity emerged. Families hid one another, neighbors shared what little food they could, and individuals risked their lives to maintain a fragile sense of humanity amid the chaos. These acts of resilience, often unnoticed in conventional military histories, underscored the profound impact that ideology can have on ordinary people. It can be a tool of oppression, but it can also inspire an extraordinary commitment to survival, moral agency, and the defense of community. The ideological underpinnings of Operation Barbarossa were also evident in the propaganda that permeated both German and Soviet societies. On one side, German narratives dehumanized the enemy, portraying the Soviet population as a monolithic mass of threats that had to be annihilated to ensure the success of the fascist project. On the other side, Soviet propaganda emphasized unity, heroism, and the sacred duty to defend the homeland, framing every soldier, worker, and civilian as a participant in a struggle that transcended individual survival. This constant ideological reinforcement shaped perceptions, motivated actions, and intensified the stakes, as every victory or setback was interpreted not merely in strategic terms, but as a moral and existential measure of ideological superiority. In retrospect, the early months of the German invasion demonstrate how ideology can both guide and misguide military strategy. The Nazi emphasis on racial hierarchy and absolute victory blinded its leaders to the practical realities of logistics, climate, and human endurance. At the same time, the Soviet commitment to defending communism and the motherland, strengthened by the palpable threat to everyday life, enabled a degree of adaptability and determination that ultimately stalled the German advance. The war became a crucible in which political beliefs were inseparable from military outcomes, and where the resilience of the human spirit emerged as a decisive factor alongside tanks, artillery, and aircraft. As we continue to explore this harrowing chapter of history, it becomes clear that the clash between fascism and communism was more than a geopolitical struggle. It was a profound confrontation of worldviews, human values, and the capacity for endurance under unimaginable pressure. The events of 1941 remind us that wars are fought not only with weapons, but with ideology, and that the consequences of these beliefs ripple through societies, shaping lives, decisions, and history itself. By the time the German war machine thundered across the Soviet frontier in June 1941, the Red Army found itself in a precarious and vulnerable position, one shaped as much by political terror as by military planning. In the years leading up to the invasion, Joseph Stalin had overseen a campaign of purges that decimated the upper echelons of the Soviet military, targeting officers accused of disloyalty, espionage, or insufficient devotion to the party. Generals, admirals, and skilled commanders vanished into labor camps or were executed outright, leaving a vacuum in leadership that would have catastrophic consequences when war arrived at the doorstep. What remained was an army whose loyalty to the party was absolute, but whose operational effectiveness was compromised by fear and a rigid, unyielding hierarchy. Orders came from the top with the expectation of unquestioning obedience, and any deviation or independent judgment could be met with harsh punishment, sometimes death. When intelligence reports arrived warning of a massive German buildup along the western borders, the signs were unmistakable, yet Stalin's skepticism and cautious nature delayed decisive action. The Soviet dictator, confident in his understanding of Hitler's strategic reasoning, could not reconcile the idea that the German leader would risk opening a two-front war that might threaten his own empire. Thus, warnings that might have prompted preemptive defensive positioning or strategic retreats were largely ignored, and troops were positioned closer to the frontier than prudence would have dictated. This overextension would become painfully evident in the days following the German assault, as mechanized divisions, tanks, and Luftwaffe squadrons advanced with terrifying efficiency into Soviet territory. The Red Army, already weakened by the purges, struggled with inflexibility. Officers were hesitant to act without explicit orders, and even minor battlefield adjustments required approval from higher-ups who themselves often lacked experience or were terrified of being accused of disloyalty. When German pincer movements encircled entire Soviet divisions, the lack of independent decision-making prevented timely retreats or counterattacks. Soldiers found themselves caught in devastating traps, unable to extricate themselves due to a command system that prioritized obedience over adaptability, a direct consequence of Stalin's efforts to consolidate power through fear. Yet within this rigid framework, human courage and improvisation began to emerge. Junior officers and even ordinary soldiers, recognizing the imminent threat to their comrades and communities, often took matters into their own hands, devising makeshift defenses, holding positions against overwhelming odds, and in some cases launching daring counterattacks that slowed German advances. The psychological impact of the purges on the Red Army cannot be understated. A generation of military leaders had been removed or silenced, and those who remained were constantly aware that failure could result not only in defeat on the battlefield, but in execution or imprisonment at home. This dual pressure from an aggressive invader abroad and a merciless state at home created an environment of intense stress and fear. Yet, paradoxically, it also forged a type of resilience. Soldiers fought with a determination born of desperation. Their loyalty was intertwined with survival, not just for themselves but for their families and communities. In this way, the rigid command structure that initially appeared as a vulnerability also became a framework within which collective discipline could manifest, allowing units to hold positions despite staggering losses. Strategically, the consequences of these purges were starkly evident during the early battles of Operation Barbarossa. Smolensk fell after intense resistance. Kiev became the site of massive encirclement and carnage, and the initial German successes seemed almost unstoppable. Yet, the very gaps left by lost experience created opportunities for rapid learning and adaptation within the surviving ranks. Officers who had escaped the purges, combined with younger commanders forced to rise quickly, began to demonstrate improvisational skills. Rallying units, reorganizing defensive lines, and coordinating counterattacks that would eventually slow the German advance. This adaptability, born out of necessity, highlighted a remarkable aspect of human ingenuity. Even in an institution hollowed out by fear and repression, the will to survive and defend could produce unexpected competence. At the same time, Stalin himself was forced to navigate a delicate balance between motivating his leadership and preserving his own authority. While publicly silent in the initial days of the invasion, he was far from passive. Behind doors, he coordinated defensive plans, consulted with remaining generals, and oversaw critical decisions that would affect the trajectory of the war. His presence, though intimidating, became a rallying point for those who understood that their actions, no matter how constrained by fear, could influence the survival of the nation. The contrast between a rigid, fearful army and a relentless enemy exploiting every weakness underscores the high stakes of this ideological and military struggle. The interplay between political purges, ignored intelligence, and rigid command structures shaped not only the outcome of the first months of Barbarossa, but also the character of the Soviet response in the long term. While the Red Army suffered unimaginable losses, the lessons learned under extreme pressure enabled a gradual evolution in tactics, command, and coordination. The purges that initially seemed to guarantee failure inadvertently fostered a climate in which resourcefulness, courage, and improvisation became critical survival skills. Soldiers who learned to navigate the perils of obedience, fear, and frontline improvisation would later become essential to turning the tide against the German invasion. In examining these early months of conflict, it becomes evident that the human element, how individuals respond under conditions of fear, uncertainty, and mortal threat, can be as decisive as tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Stalin's purges, intended to solidify control, created vulnerabilities, yet they also indirectly forced innovation and resilience among the survivors. Understanding this dynamic allows us to appreciate not only the brutal challenges faced by the Red Army but also the remarkable endurance and ingenuity that would shape the outcome of the war. As the summer of 1941 progressed, the German war machine pressed relentlessly into Soviet territory, demonstrating both the precision of modern mechanized warfare and the devastating consequences of ideological overconfidence. The initial days of Operation Barbarossa had already shattered illusions of a slow, measured campaign, as panzer divisions, supported by the Luftwaffe, moved with astonishing speed, leaving entire Soviet formations disoriented and struggling to respond. In this maelstrom of movement, entire armies found themselves encircled, their flanks cut off, supply lines severed, and communication reduced to sporadic bursts of desperate radio traffic that often failed to reach command. Cities like Smolensk and Kiev became the focal points of these encirclements, their strategic and symbolic importance drawing the concentrated attention of German commanders who believed that decisive victories here could determine the fate of the entire Eastern Front. Smolensk, in particular, became a crucible of desperation and heroism. The city was transformed into a defensive bulwark, with Soviet units improvising barricades, repurposing civilian buildings for defense, and deploying every available resource to slow the German advance. Despite the overwhelming pressure, the defenders demonstrated remarkable tenacity, engaging in house-to-house combat that turned streets into killing fields and forced German troops to adapt tactics on the fly. Yet, the speed and coordination of the German armored divisions, combined with their aerial superiority, often allowed them to bypass or isolate pockets of resistance, encircling thousands of soldiers who had no practical means of retreat. The psychological toll on both the encircled troops and the advancing Germans was immense, as the latter confronted not only the physical challenge of urban combat, but the stark reality of the suffering inflicted upon their adversaries by the operational strategy itself. Kiev, in the southwestern reaches of the Soviet Union, became an even more dramatic example of the consequences of encirclement. German planners, confident in the superiority of their mechanized warfare doctrine, concentrated forces in a manner designed to envelop the city from multiple directions. Soviet units, constrained by rigid command structures and the lingering effects of purges that had removed experienced officers, found themselves in a perilous situation, unable to coordinate effective countermeasures or strategic withdrawals. The result was a massive encirclement that trapped hundreds of thousands of soldiers, many of whom were forced to fight to the last man or surrender under conditions of extreme hardship. The fall of Kiev not only inflicted severe losses on the Red Army, but also served as a grim demonstration of the efficiency and brutality of blitzkrieg tactics, where speed, coordination, and surprise were weaponized to achieve psychological as well as military dominance. Amid the chaos of these battles, the human dimension of warfare emerged with stark clarity. Soldiers and civilians alike faced impossible choices, often acting with ingenuity and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Encircled units improvised escape routes, sometimes slipping through German lines under cover of darkness, while civilians attempted to sustain them with food, information, and morale. In Smolensk, stories circulated of small detachments holding entire streets against armored divisions, buying precious time for reinforcements to reorganize and for civilians to evacuate. In Kiev, families endured relentless bombardment, yet communities worked together to hide soldiers, provide intelligence, and maintain rudimentary medical care. These acts of resilience and solidarity, though often overshadowed in the grand narratives of military strategy, reveal how ordinary people became integral participants in the broader currents of war, shaping outcomes in ways that transcended formal plans or doctrines. The operational success of German forces, however, was tempered by the logistical realities of the Eastern Front. The rapid advances that had allowed for sweeping encirclements also stretched supply lines to their limits. Fuel, ammunition, and provisions became increasingly difficult to deliver across the vast distances of Soviet territory, while the region's terrain and climate posed constant challenges to mechanized units. Rivers, forests, and the early onset of autumn rains transformed roads into mud tracks, slowing even the most disciplined columns and forcing commanders to make hard choices about where to concentrate forces. In this context, the initial euphoria of encirclement victories was tempered by the recognition that sustaining momentum across such expanses would require extraordinary coordination, foresight, and resilience, a requirement that would soon strain even the best trained and most ideologically driven troops. As German forces pushed deeper into Soviet lands, the symbolic weight of cities like Smolensk and Kiev became evident. Capturing these centers was not only a matter of military advantage, but also a propaganda objective, intended to demonstrate the inevitability of German victory and undermine Soviet morale. Yet, the very populations the Nazis sought to intimidate often responded with astonishing resourcefulness and courage. Resistance took many forms, from armed defense and sabotage to the clandestine organization of supply networks for encircled units. Soviet command, despite its weaknesses, began to adapt, learning from early defeats and gradually implementing countermeasures to mitigate encirclement risks, demonstrating the capacity for rapid adaptation even under the most challenging circumstances. The encirclements at Smolensk and Kiev also highlighted the stark contrast between German operational assumptions and the realities of human endurance. German doctrine emphasized speed, mechanized coordination, and the shock value of rapid conquest, often assuming that the Red Army would crumble under pressure. Yet, the combination of sheer manpower, improvised defensive measures, and an unyielding commitment to protecting the homeland defied these expectations, forcing German commanders to contend with resistance that was both unpredictable and unrelenting. Even as Soviet forces suffered catastrophic losses, their ability to regroup, evacuate civilians, and maintain pockets of defense demonstrated that the early victories, while tactically impressive, were not sufficient to achieve the strategic collapse that German leaders had envisioned. In many, the battles of Smolensk and Kiev encapsulate the broader dynamics of Operation Barbarossa, a war driven by ideology, propelled by rapid technological and tactical innovation, and complicated by the immense scale of the Eastern Front. They reveal the interplay of strategy, human resilience, and the consequences of prior political decisions, such as Stalin's purges and the overextension of forces along the frontier. As we trace the German advance through these key cities, we witness not only the efficiency of mechanized warfare but also the limits of planning when confronted with an opponent motivated by existential stakes, the protection of their homeland, and indomitable will to survive, even in the face of overwhelming German advances and staggering losses. Soviet units began to reveal a resilience that would become a defining feature of the Eastern Front, demonstrating that the human element in warfare could be as decisive as tanks, aircraft, or artillery, as mechanized divisions tore through defensive lines, encircling large numbers of troops and capturing key cities. The surviving Red Army formations adapted in ways that were often improvisational yet remarkably effective, drawing upon the instincts, knowledge, and sheer determination of soldiers who understood that the stakes were nothing less than the survival of their homeland. In Smolensk, for example, units trapped by rapid pincer movements refused to capitulate despite dwindling supplies and relentless bombardment, converting civilian buildings into makeshift fortifications, laying improvised minefields, and even using local knowledge of the terrain to stage ambushes against advancing German columns. These small-scale counterattacks, often uncoordinated with central command due to communication breakdowns, nonetheless disrupted German timetables, slowed mechanized units, and created pockets of resistance that bought time for regrouping and evacuation of civilians. The improvisational skill of Soviet commanders, many of whom had survived the purges of the late 1930s, became evident in the establishment of ad hoc defensive lines and rapid reconstitution of shattered units. Young officers, thrust into positions of responsibility far earlier than they might have anticipated in peacetime, displayed an uncanny ability to make split-second tactical decisions, organizing retreating troops into cohesive formations and orchestrating localized counterattacks that leveraged every available resource. Artillery pieces abandoned in hasty withdrawals were redeployed. Anti-tank weapons were emplaced in narrow streets or wooded areas to create choke points. And even civilian volunteers were pressed into service to reinforce positions, carry messages, or provide logistical support. In this way, the Red Army's initial defeats catalyzed a kind of adaptive warfare, where innovation and improvisation became essential tools for survival and resistance. Across the southern sectors, near Kiev and the Dnieper, similar patterns emerged. Encircled units exploited knowledge of rivers, forests, and urban layouts to evade total destruction, slipping through German lines during the night or using secondary routes to regroup with larger formations further east. Soldiers who had been demoralized by initial setbacks discovered a latent resilience, drawing on personal courage, a sense of duty to comrades, and an understanding that failure to act decisively could lead not only to military defeat, but to personal catastrophe at the hands of both the enemy and internal political oversight. The dual pressures of combat and political scrutiny created a heightened awareness of stakes, yet this tension also fostered decisive improvisation, as officers balanced the need to follow orders with the practical realities of survival on the battlefield. Improvisation extended beyond the purely tactical, influencing logistical strategies as well. Supply lines disrupted by rapid German advances forced Soviet units to scavenge for fuel, ammunition, and provisions, often relying on captured enemy depots. Local agriculture, or civilian assistance to maintain operational capability. Communication breakdowns encouraged the use of runners, signal flares, and even improvised message systems to coordinate between isolated pockets of resistance. In some instances, units were forced to manufacture rudimentary defensive equipment or repair damaged vehicles with limited resources, demonstrating an ability to adapt industrial and material constraints to the pressing demands of combat. These innovations, born of necessity, created a dynamic environment in which localized ingenuity could blunt the effectiveness of a technologically superior invader. One of the most striking examples of this resilience occurred during the defensive operations around Leningrad, as German forces attempted to encircle the city and sever all supply lines. Red Army units engaged in both organized and ad hoc counterattacks, disrupting the enemy's advance and buying critical time for civilians to evacuate and for fortifications to be strengthened. Soldiers dug trenches under fire, improvised barricades from rubble, and launched small-scale offensives to reclaim strategic positions or delay mechanized columns, even when communications with higher command were fragmented or absent. These units demonstrated a capacity for autonomous action that revealed a sophisticated understanding of terrain, timing, and tactical opportunity. The combination of desperation, courage, and improvisation forged a defensive dynamic that complicated German operational assumptions and showcased the limits of relying solely on speed, technology, and initial momentum. This resilience was not limited to urban centers. In the countryside, smaller units utilized guerrilla-like tactics to harass supply convoys, sabotage bridges and railways, and ambush isolated detachments. Knowledge of the terrain, local intelligence networks, and creative problem-solving allowed these formations to act independently yet strategically, inflicting losses that, while individually minor, cumulatively hindered German operational efficiency and forced constant readjustment of plans. Ordinary soldiers became essential agents of resistance, exploiting every advantage provided by environment, improvisation, and sheer human will. Over time, these improvisational tactics contributed to a broader evolution of Soviet operational art. Lessons learned in the early weeks of the invasion: how to conduct organized withdrawals, set effective ambushes, or reconstitute shattered formations under duress were integrated into subsequent strategies that would eventually stabilize fronts and prepare for counteroffensives. The ability of Red Army units to combine resilience with local initiative demonstrated that even in the face of overwhelming technological and tactical superiority, human adaptability, courage, and determination could slow an invader, shape battlefield outcomes, and preserve the capacity for future resistance. In reflecting on these early experiences, it becomes clear that resilience in warfare encompasses more than brute force. It is the capacity to innovate, adapt, and respond creatively under pressure. The Soviet response during these critical months of 1941 illustrates the intersection of human ingenuity, collective will, and tactical improvisation, showing that even amidst staggering losses, an army's ability to recover and respond can alter the course of history. The improvisational counterattacks, localized defenses, and resourceful problem-solving of Soviet units in the face of German aggression laid the foundation for the prolonged resistance that would ultimately challenge and exhaust one of the most formidable military powers of the era, revealing a lesson that endures across time. Even in adversity, strategic resilience and human ingenuity remain decisive forces on the battlefield. By early September 1941, Leningrad, a city with a rich history and a population of over 3 million, found itself in a perilous position as the German army completed the encirclement that would make the city almost entirely isolated from the outside world. The strategic and symbolic significance of Leningrad was unmistakable. Not only was it a major industrial and logistical hub, but it also represented the ideological enemy the Nazis sought to annihilate, a bastion of communism and Soviet pride. German planners understood that a direct assault on the heavily fortified city would be costly, both in manpower and material, so they resorted to a calculated strategy of attrition, aiming to break the city not through immediate conquest but through the slow, deliberate deprivation of its civilian population. The goal was chillingly clear: by targeting food supplies, bombing granaries, and cutting off access to essential resources, the invaders sought to force surrender through starvation, turning the ordinary inhabitants of Leningrad into pawns in a vast and brutal game of siege warfare. As the blockade took hold, the citizens of Leningrad faced a reality that defied imagination. Supply lines from the outside were severed, and the once bustling streets became arenas of desperation, where the struggle to survive daily grew increasingly perilous. Factories and warehouses were stripped of all usable provisions, and any food that might sustain the population was systematically destroyed. The psychological impact of starvation, compounded by the constant threat of artillery bombardment and aerial attacks, created a climate of fear and urgency. Yet, amid the suffering, the people of Leningrad displayed extraordinary resilience, organizing ration distributions, maintaining communication networks, and finding ingenious ways to forage, preserve, and share scarce resources. Even in the darkest moments, communities banded together, converting basements and cellars into shelters and improvising stoves to heat food that might otherwise have been wasted, demonstrating that human solidarity could persist even under the most harrowing conditions. The German strategy, however, was not merely a matter of cutting off supplies. It involved a deliberate psychological component, designed to erode morale and force submission without engaging in the costly urban combat that a frontal assault would entail. Propaganda leaflets were dropped, promising safe treatment for those who surrendered or abandoned their posts, attempting to exploit fear and desperation as tools of control. The reality, however, starkly contrasted with the promises of safety, as the civilian population became increasingly vulnerable to starvation, disease, and exposure, with every passing day intensifying the human toll. Children, the elderly, and the sick were often the first to succumb, their suffering a stark testament to the indiscriminate cruelty of a strategy that conflated military objectives with ideological extermination. Despite these overwhelming challenges, the city did not capitulate. Local authorities and military leaders coordinated tirelessly to maintain defenses, fortify key positions, and organize transport for essential supplies where possible. Improvised ice roads across Lake Ladoga, later famously known as the Road of Life, became vital lifelines, allowing for the limited movement of food, fuel, and people in and out of the besieged city. These precarious supply routes demanded courage and resourcefulness, as drivers faced enemy fire, treacherous weather, and the constant threat of collapse under the weight of frost and ice. The ingenuity and bravery required to maintain these routes became emblematic of Leningrad's collective determination, transforming a city on the brink of annihilation into a symbol of resilience and defiance. The human cost of the siege, however, was staggering. Reports of starvation and malnutrition proliferated, with citizens resorting to extraordinary measures to survive, including foraging for roots, scavenging through frozen rivers for edible remnants, and, in the most extreme instances, acts of cannibalism that underscore the unimaginable conditions imposed by deliberate deprivation. Each act of survival was both a testament to human endurance and a grim reminder of the horrors of a siege, designed to inflict suffering on civilians as a weapon of war. Yet, even under these dire circumstances, the social fabric of Leningrad's population persisted. Neighbors shared what little they had, medical personnel improvised treatments, and the arts and culture continued to provide solace. With performances, lectures, and clandestine educational efforts maintaining a sense of normalcy amid devastation. Soviet military units within the city also played a crucial role in sustaining morale and organizing resistance. Despite being cut off from broader reinforcements, soldiers fortified critical points, executed targeted sorties against enemy positions, and coordinated with civilian authorities to ensure that defensive efforts were synchronized as effectively as possible under siege conditions. Improvisation, once again, became essential as commanders adapted tactics to the constraints of a besieged city, leveraging every advantage offered by urban terrain, remaining resources, and the resolve of the inhabitants. The interplay between civilian resilience and military defense created a dynamic in which the blockade, while catastrophic, failed to achieve its ultimate aim of compelling surrender. The siege of Leningrad also highlighted the broader ideological stakes of the Eastern Front. The German leadership sought not merely to defeat the Soviet military, but to erase the city as a symbol of communist resistance, to demonstrate the inevitability of their conquest, and to enact a vision of total control rooted in racial and ideological supremacy. Yet the lived reality of the siege starkly contradicted this vision. For nearly 900 days, the people of Leningrad endured deprivation, bombardment, and unimaginable suffering, and yet they persevered, their collective resistance frustrating the calculated designs of a technologically and militarily superior adversary. The defense of the city became both a moral and practical victory, illustrating that even in the most extreme circumstances, human determination and ingenuity could counteract the destructive intentions of an enemy. By the end of 1941, the blockade had exacted a horrific toll, with tens of thousands of civilians dead from starvation, disease, and exposure. The city was physically scarred, its population traumatized, and yet it remained unconquered. The perseverance of Leningrad's inhabitants became a defining chapter in the history of World War II, exemplifying the convergence of civilian fortitude, adaptive military strategy, and the unyielding will to survive against overwhelming odds. This episode stands as a powerful reminder that in warfare, the resilience of a population, its ability to adapt, endure, and resist can profoundly influence the course of events, demonstrating that human spirit is as formidable a force as any army, and that determination in the face of extreme adversity can defy even the most calculated designs of destruction. Hunger crept into every corner of Leningrad as the siege tightened its grip, an invisible enemy as relentless as the shellfire that echoed beyond the city's walls. At first, there was hope that the blockade might be broken quickly, or that supplies could be brought in through some unimagined route. But as weeks turned into months, the grim reality set in. The city was sealed off, and food was vanishing faster than it could be replaced. Bread rations, already meager, were reduced again and again until they became little more than a symbolic gesture of sustenance. What had once been a loaf was now a sliver, often stretched with sawdust or other fillers to make it last a little longer. The once bustling markets stood empty, their stalls stripped bare, and citizens scoured streets and frozen courtyards for anything remotely edible, searching for weeds that still clung to life, boiling shoe leather in desperate attempts to create something warm in their stomachs. Disease spread easily in the cold, weakened bodies of the population, aided by the scarcity of medicine and the collapse of normal sanitation. The city's hospitals, already strained before the blockade, now overflowed with patients whose illnesses were worsened by hunger. Pneumonia, dysentery, and scurvy became as deadly as enemy shells. Doctors and nurses, themselves on starvation rations, worked through exhaustion and malnutrition, improvising treatments from whatever they could find, from herbal concoctions to recycled bandages. Knowing that their efforts might stave off death for only a short time, the streets became quieter with each passing week, not from peace but from the absence of those who had once filled them. Snow buried the bodies of those who had fallen, their remains hidden until spring that revealed the true scale of loss. The city's resilience, so strong in the early days of the siege, was tested in ways few could have imagined. Families gathered in unheated rooms, pooling resources and sharing scraps, their conversations quieter now, their movements slower. Some still clung to routines as a way to keep despair at bay, reading by candlelight, stitching worn clothes, or playing music even as frost formed on the inside of the windows, yet beneath the surface. Desperation grew, and with it came choices that defied every moral instinct. Stories began to circulate, whispered at first, of those who had crossed a boundary they could never return from, resorting to the consumption of human flesh to survive. Authorities moved quickly to suppress such acts, but they could not fully erase the knowledge that in the face of unrelenting hunger, some had been driven to measures no one could have contemplated in peacetime. Rationing became both a lifeline and a torment. People queued for hours in the bitter cold, clutching ration cards with hands that trembled from weakness, knowing that the bread they would receive was barely enough to keep them alive another day. Every crumb was guarded, every morsel shared sparingly among family members. Those too weak to stand in line relied on neighbors or risked starvation at home. A black market emerged in the shadows, where the cost of food was measured in jewelry, heirlooms, and sometimes the last possessions of sentimental value. Transactions were conducted in whispers, with glances over the shoulder to ensure the authorities, or worse, hungry thieves, were not watching. And yet, in this atmosphere of deprivation and fear, moments of humanity endured. Neighbors risked their own survival to share food with those on the brink of collapse. Teachers continued to hold lessons for children too young to fully grasp the magnitude of the crisis, using the rhythms of education to protect their students from despair. Musicians performed in freezing halls, their breath visible in the air as they played for an audience wrapped in blankets, reminding those present that there was still beauty in the world beyond hunger. Even in the face of unimaginable hardship, these acts of defiance against the siege's dehumanizing intent kept a fragile thread of dignity intact. Winter was the harshest enemy. Temperatures plummeted far below freezing, and with fuel supplies exhausted, most homes were left unheated. People burned furniture, books, and anything else combustible to keep the cold at bay, even if only for a short while. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, and hypothermia took many quietly in the night. The icy streets became both a burden and a defense, as the frozen Never River was transformed into a route for sledges carrying what little food and supplies could be brought in from Lake Ladoga's perilous road of life. This lifeline was dangerous and often under attack, but it was a symbol of hope, proof that the city had not been completely abandoned to its fate. As the months dragged on, the siege became not only a military blockade, but a battle of wills between the aggressor and the besieged. The German strategy to starve the city into submission underestimated the depth of Leningrad's determination. Even as people died in staggering numbers, surrender was never seriously considered by the city's defenders. The civilian population, though racked by hunger, disease, and grief, became part of the city's defense in their own way, enduring so that the city could endure. The memory of those lost became intertwined with the determination of those who remained, each death strengthening the resolve to resist. By the time the first signs of relief began to reach the city, the toll had been almost beyond comprehension. Entire neighborhoods had been depopulated, families erased, and cultural life reduced to a shadow of its former vibrancy. Yet Leningrad still stood. The siege had intended to break the city's spirit, to force it into submission through deprivation and despair. But instead it revealed a kind of endurance that could not be measured in military terms alone. It showed that even in the face of the most deliberate and calculated cruelty, a community could hold on to its identity, its dignity, and its will to live, preserving not only a city but the human spirit itself. Even as cities like Leningrad endured unimaginable suffering, the Soviet leadership understood that survival alone would not be enough to win the war. The enemy was still advancing, still pressing on multiple fronts, and the Red Army, shattered in the opening months of the invasion, needed to be rebuilt into a force capable of not only halting the German tide but eventually driving it back. That required weapons, ammunition, and machinery in quantities that seemed impossible under the circumstances. Yet in the midst of destruction, an extraordinary effort began, one that would turn the vast industrial capacity of the Soviet Union into a war engine unlike anything the world had seen before. The key was relocation, moving entire factories from the vulnerable western regions deep into the Ural Mountains, Siberia, and Central Asia, beyond the reach of German bombers and advancing ground forces. This was no small undertaking. Entire assembly lines, machinery weighing hundreds of tons, and thousands of skilled workers were dismantled, packed onto trains, and transported across thousands of kilometers, often under the threat of attack and in bitter winter conditions. These factory migrations were feats of both logistics and human endurance. Workers often traveled alongside the machines they had spent years operating, sleeping in unheated train cars, surviving on meager rations, and arriving in remote locations where buildings were not yet ready to house the massive equipment. In some cases, production began in open fields or under hastily constructed shelters, with snow drifting through gaps in the walls and roofs. Yet the work never stopped, because every delay meant soldiers at the front would have to fight without the tools they needed. The urgency of the situation burned into the consciousness of every laborer, engineer, and manager, binding them to a shared purpose that transcended personal hardship. Among the machines that rolled off these reassembled production lines, none would become more iconic than the T-34 tank. Sleek, powerful, and rugged, the T-34 combined mobility, armor, and firepower in a way that challenged German dominance on the battlefield. It could traverse muddy fields and snow-covered terrain where heavier, more complicated German tanks often bogged down, and its sloped armor provided greater protection than the enemy's flat-sided designs. Just as importantly, it could be produced quickly and in large numbers. Even under the pressures of wartime scarcity, Soviet engineers simplified its construction without compromising its effectiveness, enabling factories, many now operating in the Urals, to turn out tanks at a pace that stunned observers. The rapid increase in production was not limited to tanks. The relocated factories also produced artillery, small arms, ammunition, trucks, and aircraft in staggering quantities. Women, teenagers, and the elderly joined the industrial workforce, taking the places of men who had gone to fight. Entire communities revolved around these factories, with long shifts, minimal rest, and a constant awareness that their labor was directly tied to survival at the front. In this way, the line between soldier and civilian blurred, as the factories themselves became another kind of battlefield, one where victory was measured not in captured territory, but in the number of tanks, rifles, and shells produced each week. At the same time, the Red Army was adapting its tactics to make full use of the equipment streaming from these new industrial centers. Units that had once been decimated in the early German offensives were rebuilt, re-equipped, and retrained, often with a new emphasis on combined arms operations that brought infantry, armor, and artillery together in coordinated strikes. The T-34 became the centerpiece of these operations, its presence on the battlefield a source of both practical advantage and psychological strength. German soldiers who had once advanced with near impunity now found themselves facing swarms of these tanks, supported by fresh artillery and infantry units, forcing them to adapt their own strategies in response. The psychological impact of this industrial resurgence cannot be overstated. In the dark days following the initial invasion, when vast stretches of Soviet territory had been lost and entire armies encircled, there was a very real fear that the nation might simply collapse under the weight of the assault. The relocation and rapid ramp-up of production shattered that fear. It proved that the Soviet Union could absorb devastating blows, reorganize, and emerge with greater strength. Each train carrying new tanks to the front was a statement of defiance, a declaration that the country would not be defeated. This industrial miracle also linked the suffering of the home front to the victories that would follow. In the frozen streets of besieged cities, in the cramped barracks of relocated workers, and in the factories lit by flickering lamps, there was an understanding that every bolt tightened and every shell packed could mean the difference between life and death for someone on the front lines. Families who had been separated by war could imagine their fathers, brothers, or sons fighting with weapons built by their own hands. That sense of direct connection to the struggle created a unity of purpose that the German war machine could never replicate. By the winter of 1941-42, the results of this effort began to show on the battlefield. Soviet units, once on the brink of collapse, launched counterattacks that slowed and sometimes reversed German advances. The T-34 became a familiar and feared sight, its engines roaring across snow-covered fields, its guns spitting fire at enemy positions. In engagements from the outskirts of Moscow to the banks of the Volga, these tanks and the soldiers who manned them began to reclaim the initiative, showing that the tide of war could indeed be turned. This transformation did not happen without cost. The relocated workers endured hunger, exhaustion, and sometimes death from overwork or poor living conditions. Machinery broke down, supply lines faltered, and there were moments when production seemed on the verge of collapse. But each crisis was met with improvisation and determination. Spare parts were fashioned from scrap, tools were repaired again and again, and in some cases, damaged tanks were cannibalized to keep others operational. The same spirit of resilience that had kept cities like Leningrad alive now fueled the industrial heart of the Soviet war effort. In the end, the relocation of factories and the rapid production of weapons like the T-34 did more than restore the Red Army's operational strength. It altered the balance of the entire conflict. It ensured that Soviet forces could meet the enemy not as a shattered army clinging to survival, but as a revitalized force capable of taking the fight back across the vast plains of the Eastern Front. It turned the Soviet Union's vast geography from a liability into an asset, and it demonstrated that in total war, the factories, the railways, and the will of the people could be as decisive as the guns at the front. The German drive toward Moscow had begun with the same momentum that had carried their armies deep into Soviet territory. But by the time the spires of the capital lay somewhere beyond the horizon, that momentum was faltering. The once fluid advance that had swept through Smolensk and encircled Kiev now found itself straining against the limits of both man and machine. The long supply lines that fed the German army stretched over hundreds of kilometers of damaged railways and rutted roads, their lifeblood of fuel, ammunition, and food trickling forward in fits and starts. Every kilometer gained came at greater cost, and the land itself seemed to conspire against them, as autumn rains transformed roads into rivers of mud that swallowed trucks, wagons, and even tanks. Yet this was only a prelude to the greater trial that lay ahead the winter of 1941. It descended with a swiftness and ferocity that stunned the invaders. Temperatures plummeted far below freezing, the kind of cold that seized metal and made engines refuse to turn, that cracked rifle bolts and rendered lubricants useless, that froze breath into crystals on a soldier's scarf. German troops, accustomed to the milder winters of Western Europe and ill-equipped for such extremes, found their uniforms inadequate and their boots failing to keep out the biting frost. Frostbite became as much an enemy as the Red Army. Claiming fingers, toes, and sometimes entire limbs, vehicles broke down more frequently, their parts snapping in the cold, and horses, still a critical part of the German supply chain, died in great numbers, unable to endure the relentless chill. While the weather punished the attackers, Moscow itself was transforming into a fortress. The city's population, from factory workers to students, joined in an immense effort to build defenses. Trenches were dug across open ground, barbed wire strung across likely avenues of approach, and anti-tank obstacles fashioned from steel and concrete sprouted along the roads leading into the capital. Thousands of wooden structures were dismantled to clear lines of fire or to provide timber for defensive works. In the outskirts, the earth was scoured with networks of bunkers, gun pits, and minefields, a physical barrier that mirrored the determination of those who built them. The citizens of Moscow, many of whom had already endured the shock of seeing their nation's western cities fall, now worked with a conviction born of the knowledge that their own survival depended on these preparations. The Red Army, revitalized by the flow of weapons from relocated factories and bolstered by reserves brought in from the Far East, took up positions behind these defenses. Among them were soldiers hardened by months of fighting, as well as newly trained recruits who had never before faced the enemy. The front lines bristled with artillery, mortars, and the now familiar shape of the T-34, its engine warm under canvas covers to keep it ready for action despite the cold. The Soviet High Command understood that the capital was more than a city, it was a symbol, and its fall would be a political and psychological blow from which recovery might be impossible. Every measure, no matter how desperate, was taken to ensure that did not happen. When the Germans renewed their push in late November, they found themselves not striking at a collapsing defense, but battering against a wall of resistance. Their attacks met counterfire at every turn, and when breakthroughs were attempted, Soviet reserves moved quickly to seal the gaps. The cold gnawed at their stamina, the endless resistance sapped their morale, and the knowledge that the city still stood despite months of effort began to weigh heavily. In some sectors, the German advance slowed to a crawl, with gains measured in meters rather than kilometers, each step paid for in blood. The dream of a swift conquest of the Soviet capital began to dissolve in the frozen fields and shattered villages outside its reach. Then came the counteroffensive. On the morning of December 5, 1941, Soviet forces struck back along a wide front, surprising many German units that had believed the Red Army too exhausted to mount such an effort. Fresh troops, clad in white winter camouflage and supported by artillery and armor, surged forward, driving the enemy from positions they had fought hard to take. The T-34s, which handled the snow and ice with far greater ease than their German counterparts, played a decisive role, crushing through defensive lines and cutting off isolated units. The attacks were relentless, coordinated, and sustained, forcing the Germans into a retreat that they had not planned for and were ill-prepared to execute. The counteroffensive pushed the Germans back dozens of kilometers from the capital, securing not only Moscow but also the morale of the entire Soviet Union. It was proof that the Red Army could do more than endure, that it could strike back with force and determination. The psychological impact was profound. For the Soviets, it marked the end of the belief that the enemy was unstoppable. For the Germans, it was the first undeniable sign that the campaign in the East would not end in the quick, decisive victory they had envisioned. Behind the front, the city of Moscow carried on with a grim determination. Factories continued to produce, schools operated despite the constant threat of air raids, and the people adapted to the new normal of wartime life. The sound of artillery in the distance was a reminder that the danger had not passed, but also a reassurance that the front remained far enough away to give them breathing space. The knowledge that their collective effort digging trenches, building barricades, enduring shortages had played a role in saving the capital was a source of quiet pride. The winter of 1941-42 became a turning point not because it ended the war, but because it shattered the illusion of German invincibility and proved that the Soviet Union could stand, fight, and push back. The weather, the logistical strain, the citizen-built defenses, and the will of the Red Army had together achieved what many had thought impossible. Moscow did not fall. Instead, it stood as a testament to the resilience of a nation under siege, a reminder that even in the darkest and coldest days, the determination of a people could hold back an army. As the German army advanced deeper into Soviet territory, the war they waged was not limited to the clash of armies or the occupation of cities. It was a campaign shaped by ideology as much as by strategy, and the orders carried by soldiers often extended far beyond the battlefield. Behind the front lines, in towns and villages that had already endured the shock of invasion, a far darker reality began to unfold. The occupying forces operated under a vision of the East as a land to be remade, its people subjected, displaced, or eliminated in accordance with the beliefs that underpinned the regime in Berlin. For the civilians caught in this storm, the presence of the German army meant not only the loss of sovereignty, but the onset of a systematic assault on their very existence. The violence began quickly and without disguise. Entire communities were rounded up, accused of aiding partisans or harboring enemies, though often no such evidence was needed. In many cases, suspicion alone was enough to seal a village's fate. The men would be separated from the women and children, sometimes under the pretense of questioning, only for gunfire to follow minutes later from a nearby field or forest. Homes were looted, food stores emptied, livestock taken, and possessions destroyed or carted away. Those left behind were forced to survive in the shell of what had once been their home, stripped of the resources they needed to endure the coming winter. Mass shootings became a grim and familiar sight across occupied territories. They were often carried out in broad daylight, with the victims marched to prepared pits or ravines where the ground would later be hastily covered. Though never enough to conceal the truth from those who remained, these actions were not isolated or random but coordinated, a part of the wider policy that sought to reshape the population through terror and elimination. Entire segments of society were singled out for destruction: community leaders, teachers, intellectuals, and especially those targeted because of their ethnicity or political beliefs. In cities and towns, makeshift prisons and holding areas were established where interrogations, beatings, and executions became a part of daily life. The ideological nature of the occupation meant that brutality was not merely tolerated but encouraged. Soldiers and officers were reminded that their mission was not only to defeat the Red Army, but to dismantle the social and cultural fabric of the Soviet territories. This mindset blurred any line between combatant and civilian, allowing atrocities to be justified as acts of security or necessity. In many places, collective punishments were imposed. If partisans attacked a German patrol, nearby villages could be burned and their inhabitants executed, regardless of whether they had any connection to the resistance. The objective was not justice but intimidation, the creation of an environment where fear would suffocate any thought of defiance. Yet defiance did not disappear. Partisan activity persisted and often grew in response to such acts, with civilians supplying information, shelter, or direct assistance to fighters in the forests and countryside. The Germans, in turn, intensified their reprisals, creating a cycle of violence in which the civilian population suffered most. As the months passed, the scale of the devastation became evident. Depopulated villages, burned fields, and the silent absence of those who had once filled them. In urban centers, the occupation took on a different but equally oppressive character. Ghettos were established in some cities, cutting off entire communities from the outside world, restricting their movement, and subjecting them to starvation and disease. Work details were organized to extract labor from the occupied population, with many deported to Germany to toil in factories or on farms. Families were separated, and survival often depended on barter, secrecy, and the mercy of strangers. The occupying administration controlled food supplies, issuing rations that barely sustained life, while markets operated under heavy restrictions and constant surveillance. For the German army, these measures were not a distraction from the war effort, but an integral part of it. The destruction of communities and the suppression of civilian life were seen as necessary steps toward reshaping the conquered territories into the image envisioned by Nazi leadership. This was a vision that allowed no space for coexistence, only for domination. The brutality served both practical and symbolic purposes: to weaken the enemy by eradicating its people, and to signal the permanence of the new order they sought to impose. As the tide of war began to shift and Soviet forces slowly pushed back, they advanced into areas where the consequences of occupation lay in plain view. Survivors emerged from forests, hiding places, and cellars to tell their stories, accounts of relatives who had vanished, villages reduced to ash, and neighbors taken away in the night, never to return. The physical evidence was everywhere: mass graves hastily concealed, buildings blackened and crumbling, fields left fallow because there were no longer enough people to tend them. The scale of loss was not just in numbers, but in the cultural and social life that had been deliberately dismantled. These occupied territories became a testament to the reality of the war in the East, where ideological goals shaped military conduct in ways that magnified suffering far beyond the battle lines. They revealed a conflict in which civilians were not simply collateral damage but deliberate targets, their fate bound to the policies of a regime that measured victory not only in captured land, but in the destruction of entire communities. In the memory of those who lived through it, the occupation would remain as searing as any battle. Its scars measured not only in the destruction of property or the loss of loved ones, but in the attempt to strip away dignity, culture, and hope. And yet, even under such oppression, many found ways to resist, whether through acts of open defiance or the quiet determination to survive in the face of deliberate annihilation. It was a truth that the occupiers had not foreseen, that in trying to break the spirit of the people, they often strengthened it, planting the seeds of resistance that would, in time, grow into the force that helped drive them back. In the early summer of 1941, when German columns surged across the Soviet frontier, the architects of Operation Barbarossa envisioned an irresistible tide that would sweep away all opposition before it. The speed of the initial advance, the rapid encirclements at places like Smolensk and Kiev, and the sheer disarray of Soviet defenses seemed to confirm their expectations. In Berlin, there was little doubt that victory was only a matter of time, yet beneath this appearance of unstoppable momentum lay the seeds of failure, planted by overconfidence, a chronic underestimation of the enemy's will to resist, and a logistical framework that could not keep pace with the ambitions of the campaign. From the outset, the German High Command believed they understood their opponent. The purges of the Red Army in the late 1930s, which had removed countless experienced officers, appeared to have gutted Soviet military competence. Early battlefield results seemed to validate this assumption, as German armored spearheads outflanked rigid Soviet formations and captured vast numbers of troops. However, these impressions ignored deeper truths. The Soviet Union's capacity to absorb losses, reorganize, and adapt was unlike anything Germany had faced in the West. Its vast geography, immense industrial base, and ability to mobilize civilians into the war effort meant that the destruction of field armies, while devastating, was not decisive in the way German planners had expected. This miscalculation was compounded by an unwavering faith in the Blitzkrieg model, which had brought swift victories in Poland, France, and the Balkans. In the minds of many German officers, the Soviet Union would crumble just as quickly. What they did not account for was the sheer scale of the Eastern Front. The distances involved dwarfed anything the Wehrmacht had encountered before, stretching supply lines to the breaking point. The farther the panzers advanced, the more tenuous their lifeline became. With fuel, ammunition, and food often arriving late or in insufficient quantities, horse-drawn transport still made up a significant portion of German logistics, and it struggled to match the pace of mechanized units. Roads turned to mud in the autumn rains, and railways required conversion from Soviet to German gauge before they could be used, slowing the flow of supplies to a crawl. Meanwhile, the Soviet response was gathering strength. Even as they lost territory and cities, the Red Army's resilience began to show. Local counterattacks disrupted German timetables, while factories relocated deep into the Urals churned out tanks, aircraft, and artillery at a pace that astonished German intelligence. The appearance of the T-34, with its sloped armor and wide tracks, challenged the superiority of German armor and forced costly adjustments. Entire communities became part of the war effort. Fortifying defenses, producing equipment, and sustaining the army in the field. These developments chipped away at the certainty of a quick and total victory. The German leadership, however, often misinterpreted these setbacks as temporary rather than symptomatic of a deeper problem. Overconfidence fueled the belief that with just one more push, one more decisive encirclement, the Soviet Union would collapse. This mindset drove the decision to divert resources toward Leningrad, Moscow, and the southern oil fields simultaneously, diluting the concentration of force that had been so critical to earlier successes. The result was that none of these objectives was fully achieved before the onset of winter. As the weather turned, the shortcomings of German preparation became brutally clear. Troops lacked adequate winter clothing, lubricants froze in vehicle engines, and weapons jammed in the frigid air. Supply lines, already strained, now buckled under the additional burdens of snow and ice. The same confidence that had propelled the invasion had also led to a dangerous neglect of contingency planning. German commanders had not seriously considered the possibility of fighting a prolonged campaign through the Russian winter, believing instead that the war would be won before the first snow fell. It was in these conditions that Soviet counteroffensives around Moscow struck with force. The combination of fresh reserves, citizen-built defenses, and a determined command capitalized on German exhaustion and logistical paralysis. For the first time, German units were not only halted but driven back. The failure to capture Moscow was more than a lost objective, it was a symbolic blow that shattered the illusion of German invincibility. Looking back, the collapse of Barbarossa's promise was not the result of a single misstep but of a chain of interconnected flaws. Overconfidence blinded the German high command to the strategic depth and resilience of their opponent. The underestimation of Soviet capacity to recover from early disasters allowed those disasters to be viewed as conclusive rather than fleeting. Logistical inadequacy. An Achilles heel from the very beginning became insurmountable as the campaign wore on. Together, these factors transformed what was intended to be a lightning strike into a grinding war of attrition, one for which Germany was neither prepared nor equipped. The Eastern Front would go on to consume the bulk of German military resources for the remainder of the war. But the turning point had already arrived in that first winter. The swift victory that had been promised to the German people and expected by its leaders was gone, replaced by the grim reality of a prolonged struggle against an opponent who refused to be broken. The failure of Barbarossa was not only a military setback, but a decisive shift in the course of the war, marking the moment when the strategic initiative began to slip from Germany's grasp and the long, brutal path toward eventual defeat began. As the brutal months of fighting wore on, the German dream of total conquest in the East began to dissolve, eroded not only by the vastness of the Soviet Union and the ferocity of its winters but, more profoundly, by the unshakable will of its people. Across cities, towns, and endless stretches of countryside, the Soviet population refused to bow. Soldiers fought with unrelenting determination. Civilians labored in factories or fortified defenses, and entire communities adapted to survive the unthinkable. Nowhere was this resilience more vividly displayed than in the besieged city of Leningrad. From September 1941 onward, Leningrad was subjected to a siege that would last nearly 900 days, an ordeal unparalleled in modern warfare. The city was encircled almost completely, cut off from regular supply routes, and deliberately starved by its enemy. Yet it refused to surrender. The people endured winters that froze the Neva River solid, faced bombings that shattered homes and public buildings, and confronted hunger so severe that every crumb of bread, every drop of soup, became precious beyond measure. They rationed what little they had, shared when they could, and worked tirelessly to maintain the city's defenses. Even in the depths of despair, art, music, and education persisted in whatever small form was possible, as if to declare that life and culture would not be extinguished by hardship. The Red Army's defense of Leningrad was mirrored by countless other acts of resistance across the Soviet Union. Partisan fighters in the forests harassed German supply lines. Workers deep in the Ural Mountains toiled day and night to produce weapons and ammunition. And soldiers at the front stood their ground against overwhelming odds. Each act, no matter how small, contributed to the growing strength of the Soviet war effort. Together, they created a wall of defiance that German forces could not break, no matter how many divisions they threw against it. Leningrad's prolonged survival became a symbol not only for the Soviet people but for the entire world, a living testament to human endurance under the most extreme conditions. It proved that even in the face of systematic destruction, a united and determined population could hold out against a seemingly unstoppable enemy. This spirit of defiance, born out of desperation and sustained by hope, would echo across the Eastern Front, inspiring those in other besieged cities. In trenches, and on the factory floor, when the siege finally broke and the city was liberated, it was not merely a military victory. It was the culmination of human willpower prevailing over calculated oppression. The streets of Leningrad bore the scars of bombardment and deprivation, and its people carried the weight of immense loss. But they had not been broken. The defense of Leningrad and the broader resistance of the Soviet Union ensured that Operation Barbarossa would end not with the swift victory Germany had anticipated, but with the beginning of a long and grinding retreat that would eventually push the invaders back to their own borders. The story of this struggle is not only a chapter in military history. It is a reminder of what human beings are capable of when survival and freedom are at stake. It tells us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to face it. It shows us that determination can be a weapon as powerful as any army, and that unity in the face of adversity can change the course of history. So as we close this chapter on the early years of the Eastern Front, let us carry forward the lessons of resilience, unity, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. If you have found this journey through history as compelling as we have, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the stories still to come. Your support helps us keep exploring the moments that shaped our world. And together, we can ensure that these stories are never forgotten. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for taking the time to remember. Wherever you are, I wish you a peaceful night and a restful sleep. Good night.